I'm just going to call you Josh right now to irritate you. Just kidding. Cool. So we are now recording, and so we'll be able to look back on this. So that the middle column again is just thinking about that objective about can TDD a simple React app? What evidence can you plan to get to feel more confident? What could you do to feel confident about being able to test drive a simple React app? I'm sure there's a bunch of things.
I'm really sorry, I still don't understand the second question. So is it to provide evidence why I feel more confident in something, or how to get more confident? Or
Yeah, it's probably not a very well worded question, so I'll think about that later. So this question is meant to think about where you are now compared to where you want to be to feel confident that you can test drive a simple React app. So what are the gaps, and then like what evidence can you do to like get better at it? So maybe, for example, it's like I'm still not sure about different components, for example, like when do I use different components to build a simple React app? So I'm going to focus on understanding how to do stateful and stateless components, and that's what we're going to do today. Okay. Or maybe it's about how to set up React testing library, or maybe it's about a couple of things. But just trying to diagnose what are the sort of steps ahead of us to feel confident that we can test drive a simple React. Just another minute. Just another minute. Cool. So what do we feel more confident about? Using TDD, being a factor to put together a React app, knowing the process of how to test the experience, these experience, and lead to how to implement React component, building a simple component. Just read on the different React plugins and feel have a better idea of what the hell is going on. Set up React app, understanding what's in there, and TDing a single component. Nice. Starting up a React project, writing simple tests, but not the code to pass tests, just how to copy the actual code to pass tests. And starting a simple React app and understanding the elements that go into starting one. Nice. That's what we feel more confident at the moment. The things that we want to do, what evidence can we plan to get to feel more confident? Still not 100% sure about the testing syntax, so I want to be able to reproduce tests without looking back at old projects. When I was reading through the official website, especially the props to state section, I can start to understand a bit more what the document example represent. Working on project 2 without following the walkthrough, I understood the syntax of the tests given to us. Comparing the work we've done so far to create React app and seeing the difference between them, and learn to write the actual components to make the test pass. So those are things, those are evidence that we want to collect. And then a couple of questions and thoughts. If rendering the snapshot is for testing only, yes, pretty much. Having been thinking about how to test and implement multiple input, guess need to find time to try it. Sounds reasonable. Seems like knowing more about event handlers in JavaScript will be really helpful in React. Yep. Yeah, we will probably comment to a couple bits of it today. That will be interesting to dive a little bit more into that at some point, maybe. I wondered whether I should have already known all the JavaScript to write the code. If so, I need to do independent learning on that. Okay. Yeah, I think as long as we can write a function, I think that's mostly all we need to do, and that's just a matter of syntax. It's probably, you're probably right. The more JavaScript you know, the easier it will be. But I don't think it's actually a requirement. At least as long as you do independent learning on the side to sort of compensate or to continue learning, I think that's true. Cool. All right, this is nice. This gives me some information for me to understand like how everyone's thinking at the moment, which is nice. And this middle column, what evidence we plan to get, is most of the point of this short reflection. Is like, how can we direct our learning? What can we do to feel more confident? So this is cool. Any other thoughts or questions at the moment before we dive into today's workshop? Cool. Okay, so you should be looking at my screen now if you weren't. So I'm going to go back out to the React directory. I'm going to go into the skills workshop. So we're going to have a look at this today. This is, I saw some of you put down like writing components or writing some of the code to sort of pass the test, and this is what we're going to try and focus on today, thinking about components in two different ways, components that have state and components that don't. And this is very similar to the idea of what state is and what props is in React components. So we're gonna think about components in this way, and the two objectives that we have for this session is to be able to explain the difference between a stateful and a stateless component, and then just build a simple app using both kinds of components. So I'm going to just demonstrate using the two different kinds of components in an app. We'll have a quick Q&A about it, and then I want to let you all dive into doing it yourself with a set of simple requirements that you'll start from scratch again. You'll create React app, and you'll just spike code. We're not going to worry about testing for this session, just to sort of see how we can use components together. A couple extra resources down here to have a look at, and some more stuff to dive into later. But we won't be doing these today. So that's the shape of what we're going to do today. And this hopefully will give you some more context and help you drive towards the project 3, which is to test drive a simple app or yet another to-do list app. How does that sound? Yeah, cool. Okay, so I am going to okay, so I'm in this directory here, which is this directory. I realized, why can't I click on that? Why push just an empty directory? I might just push an empty directory. All right, I'm going to figure that out later. After I do the demonstration, I'll come back to that. That's a bit odd. Okay, so I'm in this directory, this is essentially just a create React app, and so I have a very simple app that does absolutely nothing at the moment. We'll have a look at what it does. If I run yarn starts to run my application. So there's absolutely nothing in here, and I just want to build out a simple application that uses a component that uses state and a component that doesn't use state. So this is literally all it does. There's absolutely nothing in here. It has one main app component, and that's it. So I thought maybe the simplest way to do this would be to build a component that build like an application that maybe resembles like rolling dice. And so every time we click a button, we just roll a bunch of dice. The way that you should think about it is in the way that components should either be a component that needs to know about its state, or things that don't need to know about state. So if I think about rolling dice, the dice roll itself, let's say, for example, we have 3 dice. We need to have a component that knows about the numbers of each die, and it stores it, and then can modify it whenever you click on this button to change it, to randomly change a bunch of dice. But each die itself doesn't need to know about its own state, doesn't need to change it, it just needs to render a number. So we're going to have 2 kinds of component. We're going to have one component that's essentially is like a container of die, and keeps track of this one bit of state, which is the numbers that we're randomizing. And then it will delegate or pass this data via props to child components. So let me actually go back to the mirror board for a second to see whether I can draw a diagram. Maybe I think it'll probably be helpful. So I'm going to, if you look at my screen, you should be seeing the mirror board. And let's just create a little workspace. Let's keep it big for now. So very simply, imagine we had this like component that was our dice, that represents, what is it, like our dice roll. We can zoom in here. So this dice roll needs to care about essentially the numbers. Let's say, for example, we had numbers 1, 2, and 3. This would be like this, maybe like the starting set of numbers for our dice, and we need to update this. So this is the bit of state that we need to manage. If we're needing to manage state and update it, then this needs to be a stateful component. And the common way we do this is using class component. For each of, if we take this number and say, for example, we're going to then create 3 different, let's call this like each individual die. Okay, so I didn't really think about this, but the terminology we're using is a lot of die everywhere. Let's just ignore that and represent it and think about it as a dice. This doesn't actually have to update its own state. It just takes whatever it gets passed to it from dice roll and renders it. So this would just be the number 1, the number 2, and the number 3, for example. As a result, we don't need a class component of this. We just need what we call like a functional component. There's not much that this component has to do. It just has to return some HTML. And the only thing that we need to is like pass this variable through to it, so it has a dynamic way to represent a number. So this is essentially the main difference between stateful components and stateless components. Is like, does it need to manage state? Do we need to update or change it? If so, then yes, use a class component, and then delegate to child components via props. And we're going to do that in just a second. So you'll see this commonly, like at the end of the bottom of a tree of components, you'll see hopefully functional components at the bottom, which don't need to do much. And sometimes signs that your component is doing too much is if there are lots of things happening. But we're going to try and implement this pattern here where we have a dice roll that has an array of numbers as its state, and then it creates functional components to represent each of the die rolls. Does that, as a model, does that make sense at the moment? Helly, what are you thinking?
I'm trying to understand how the class component, the state of it changes. I don't understand why that would change. So the class component basically includes 3 rolls of the dice.
Pretty much, exactly. It will delegate. The way that I'm thinking about it, it's going to delegate to a functional component to represent each of the roles. Yes.
But what changes?
Yeah. These numbers here. So at some point, I want to have like a button maybe in this component that's like a. Let's just say, for example, we have like. Why is my pen not working? Hold on. I'll figure that out later. Sometimes it does that. So imagine I had a button here that said roll. I'm no longer using my pen, so my handwriting is terrible. Imagine I had a button here that every time I click this, we're going to update these numbers. We're going to randomize it. As a result, we're changing or managing the state.
Oh, right. So the 1, 2, and 3 are actually the result of the roll of the dice.
Exactly.
They're not die number 1, 2, and 3. It could be like 4.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So sometimes people think that maybe each of the die need to have their own state, and then like you click on it and update it, and that's the wrong way to think about it. The dice roll container is the thing that is going to manage a state and then delegate to functional components to render each of the die. Now, not to say that it couldn't work. We could very easily just put this all in one component. But where possible, we're trying to think about like concerns, and this would be a better way to think about it. We have one dice roll component that's just about managing the state, and then delegates as needed to child components. And the main way we do this is one directionally via props. We send data so down the tree via props. And via what props mean is it's just an object with like property value pairs. That's what we mean by props in JavaScript. And we just send these key value pairs through to child components. So let's have a look at it and how this works. And feel free to keep this like image next to the code that we write, so you can sort of like see how we represent this. But this is the picture I have in my mind as we go through and have a look. So at the moment, I'm in this like blank React application, and I have my app class. This is again straight from create React app. I've removed some of the bloat. This is all straight from it. So the first thing that I want to do is add in my, let's just call it what it was in the diagram, our dice roll component. Now clearly I haven't written it yet, so let's import it and then create a file for it. And dice rolls, just one, please. Cool, let's go ahead and create our dice roll class. So all this is doing is say, please, when you render this, render my React app, also cascade and get my dice roll to do its thing. And my dice roll at the moment is nothing. So I need to think about this. In my diagram, I said that I need a class component, a stateful component. So let's import React to make everything work. And we also, because we have a class component, we're going to extend the component class. So as a result, we need to make sure we import it. Let's go component, and let's just stay there for a moment. So once we've imported it, I usually forget to export it as well. So once I've imported all things I need to, I also need to export the object I'm creating, which will be a dice roll. I usually do that first, just so I get out of the way, otherwise I forget it. So then my class component is going to be called dice roll, and this is going to extend a component, and component. Usually we can initialize all our components with props. So we pass it as an argument. This is just a named argument. We can call this whatever we want to, but conventionally we call it props. And then the first thing we do is we send that, we need a constructor argument, a constructor function. So because it's a class, we need a class syntax. I'm doing a bit backwards, sorry folks. Okay, class, dice roll, we extend the component, we need a constructor function. And I think I'm gonna have to double check my JavaScript in just a second. I think I put the constructor, because it's a constructor function, I initialize with props here, and then I send it to React to do its thing. And then I have to set state and say, for example, in our diagram, where's my diagram gone? In my diagram, let's just say we have an initial state of an array of numbers. Let's just say we're gonna start our dice roll off at 1, 2, 3. So we're gonna have a property called dice, and the value is going to be 1, 2, 3. So let's start there with our constructor function for our dice roll component. And for a component, we need to have a render method, and for it to return some an HTML thing. So I usually just straight away create a div and closing div, because we should only ever return one element. And I usually like to name it with a class if at any point I want to sort of target it. So let's just call this dice roll. And in this dice roll, what I want to do is go through my state and just create a functional die component for each of these numbers. I'll worry about the button later. I'm just going to let's just see whether we can represent all these three numbers in the moment. So we have to use the curly braces to show that it's JavaScript. So let's go this state and let's go through each of the items in the array. And what I want to return is a die component. So I'm going to pass in a function to my map that is going to take each of the numbers and then return a die component. So let's say that each of the items in the dice array is going to be a die number, and then I want to return let's return a die component. And I want to say I'm going to pass in via props, so this is going to be a key value pair, the number, which is the die. So I think this is the way that I'm thinking about it. I'll create the die in a second. If I use die here, it means I need to import it. Die. Import die from die. Sorry, I should have chosen a better domain for this. Okay, so it's very uplifting. This is very uplifting. Okay, so I have a class component, and I am setting up my component, and then I set state. And I'm not changing or modifying at the moment. We'll get that. We'll add in a button that changes it. But I just want to take this state, loop through it, and return a new component. And this component, now that I've imported it, let's create it. It'll stop me finding at some point. And then here I'm going to import React from React. And at this point, we don't need a class component. We just need a functional component. So we could do, how we do it here? We just do like this. This is, again, a functional component, right? So we just write die, pass in props like this, and then it has one return function. That's essentially a functional component. And we need to make sure we remember to export it. Export our component, our function. So inside of this functional component, what I need to do is return an element. So let's return an element, and let's call it a die. And all this does is it takes the object and it's going to represent a number, right? So let's wrap this number in. I guess we can just leave like this, right? We take the props and we extract the number from it. We just get the property. This is an object that we pass in from dice roll, like so. And that means that we have access to number as a property to do whatever is the object dot number to get the value there. So that should all be all that I need to do. And props dot number. I have my dice roll And I inject my dice roll here. Yeah. All right. So let's see what errors are happening when I try and load this simple app. Oh, there's a warning here, but let's just see whether it's working correctly. I've got 3 numbers displayed at the moment. So I changed it to like, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6. That should just update. Nice. Okay, so there's a warning here that says each child in a list should have a unique key property. So when we loop through an array, React is saying that we want to be able to identify each of these objects that we are sort of rendering. So pass in another key prop. So the key prop means we just pass it in as an attribute and value pair, and has to be something unique. So let's just use the index. It's just a bit of React that asks you to make sure that you have like a way to identify each of the child components. Cool. Okay, so we have a way to represent a dice roll, like a class component that then delegates 5 props to child components. And those are functional components at the moment. This is what a functional component looks like. It just has a function that returns some JSX and some HTML that has got some JavaScript in it. It's quite simple. We use the property objects and we extract values via the property names. And we can pass that from the parent component like this. So these are all available as properties. And the only reason that we're using a class component, because at some point we want to manage this state, we want to update it and change it. So before I go on to the next part, I want to just stop here for a second, put it side by side, and just do any questions or thoughts that come to mind as we have this up on the page. What do you notice? What do you think about the way that this stateful component works with the stateless component? Make sense? Is it any questions, any confusions? Yes, go ahead. I think it's Joanna, right?
No. How do you know I was going to ask a question?
Yeah.
Yes, I do have a question. I've been learning a little bit of React from other tutorials, and sometimes for the stateless functions, they use they call it like a parent component and child component.
Yeah.
And I guess the child component is like the same as the function that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
But it's still a class. It just didn't have this constructor thing or the state thing inside it. It still inherits the state. Is that the same thing? It's just a different way of writing it, or actually they work differently? The function component and the child component that I was talking about.
Yeah, great question. So one is they're used in different ways. So they're usually the same thing, but not always. So a parent and a child relationship, when we talk about components, is one where a parent delegates or cascades the next component to do some work. So here, the parent component is dice roll and the child component is die. Simply because we're telling dice roll to then create components. So that it doesn't really matter whether they're stateful or stateless. They could be both. So you could have a parent-child relationship with both functional components or both with class components. It doesn't matter. Does that make sense, first of all?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. So then the second one is like, do we need to manage state? If so, we'll use a class component. Otherwise, we'll use a functional component.
Okay.
Good question. Mincy, did you have a question?
It's pretty much the same question. Like I've seen that like you can use class and function, but usually just function doesn't have the constructor. So
exactly.
I want to ask like, so why do you separate them? They are actually the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. And the only reason at the moment that we need to worry about is, do we need to set state? if we need to set state, then you should be using a class component because we need a constructor function to set it up properly. And the reason why we're using a class component this way, because we do want to manage state, because at some point we want to modify this. So before I actually demonstrate how we do this, just any more thoughts or questions on what you see up on the screen at the moment? There might be more as comments, so just drop them down and we'll go through them at the end. Cool. Okay, so we want to make this a little bit more dynamic and actually to get to the point of this, which is how do we manage this state. And the idea is what I want to do, if we go back to my diagram, is I want to have this button roll that then triggers an event. So let's add in our button. And you can use a bunch of different elements that can create events that we can hook into. But let's use a button click event. So I need a non-click event handlers, which I'm going to create a function for. Let's just call it a roll function. So every time I click it, I want to then execute this roll function that I'm sending as a callback. And I want that roll function to then update state. So, which means the next thing I have to do is create my roll function. Okay, so we have a couple of different ways we'll do this. We'll do this, let's do this the easiest way, I think. I think I can do it like this. So here I'm creating, I might have to check the syntax in a second, but what I want to do is create a function called roll that then updates state. I don't need any arguments, and so there's this bit of code that will execute, and what I want to do at the end of this is call this.setState. Now, this.setState is important. This allows us to modify the state, and we use a function set state rather than modify it directly. Never try to modify it directly. You want to always use this function to update your state, set state, and you pass in an object. You can also pass in functions, but let's just worry about passing an object for the moment. And I want to set my dice property to be, let's say, a new set of dice. It'll just be a randomized set of dice. Let's call it random dice. What is random dice? Well, we need to figure that out. I always work backwards. So my random dice is going to be, I want 3 random numbers. So let's just take, maybe it's not the best way to do it, but it doesn't matter, I'm just doing it. Let's take the current dice and map through it. So take each of the numbers, and what I want to do is return a random number. So I'm going to create an array of random numbers. So here's going to be like, return random number. How do I do random number in JavaScript? Random integers. Let's look it up.
Math not random.
Feels like that's probably what I need to use. There's JavaScript's not very good at random numbers, is it? JavaScript random numbers between 2 inches, 2 numbers, 2 inches. Let's go 2 inches. Math random number. Maybe. Ooh, something like this. Min and the max, you take the range, add 1 to it, multiply it by what floor? Crikey. Is that really the way to do it? Gosh, why does this website take so long to load? I feel like that probably works. So I guess we'll just create a function here. Get random integer, fine. Get random integer. I guess we'll just show that we don't actually want to expose it. It's just convention, I guess. And we go 1 to 6. Is that how it's going to work? Minimum, maximum, return map, or random min max. Maybe it's JavaScript, right? We'll see. We'll have a look at some errors in a second. Random dice, we map through the dice, we return a random integer between 1 and 6, so we'll have an array of random dice, and then we tell state, update state with this, but by the property dice with a new set of random dice. And that should then, whenever you call set state, it then re-renders the component. So let's have a look. Get random integer is not defined. Let's solve that. Because I need to call this dot random integer. Ooh, my button has no text. Roll. Cool. Okay, so we have a bunch of random numbers. It works. Thanks, Helly. That was gratifying. So this is the way that we've done it. Now, we have to be careful here. The way that I've written this function, I'm making sure that I've bound the value of this using an arrow function. If we weren't using an arrow function, I would have to bind it here. So this would be equivalent the same as if I did it like that, I would then have to do something like to make sure I had the same execution context. So this can be tricky, but one of the great things about ES6 is that we can get around this problem of making sure that we pass in the right context by using the arrow function. So this should still work, yeah. Now, if we didn't have this line here, this would break, because we would have no idea what this is. So that might be interesting to watch back. I don't want to spend too much time on it right now. The way to avoid this problem entirely is just use an arrow function here to make sure that we give the right execution context. Okay, let's pause again for any questions or thoughts on how this works. Thoughts and questions? Yeah, go ahead, shout it out.
So the ES6 syntax is actually more recommended rather than using the dot bind then? Yes.
But if I were to read it, I would probably ask you to just use the arrow syntax, unless the whole code base was written in a prior version, where like then having two competing versions doesn't make much sense. But where possible, yes. The bind method actually became available in ES5 for this reason.
Mm-hmm.
But you can actually write it yourself. It doesn't.
And is it only because you're using it as a callback, so you need to use the arrow function, but when you don't need to use it as a callback, you can just write
pretty much
syntax?
Yeah, exactly. Because when I use it down here, it wouldn't know what this is. It wouldn't know what this is. So we need to make sure we found it.
Okay.
There might be, where can we get more information about this if you're interested? Things to look up would be I might imagine I'm sure React has a bunch of documentation about this. Find synthetic events.
Yeah, they have it here.
You have to be careful about the meaning of this. In JavaScript, class methods are not bound by default. If you forget to bind it, they'll be undefined when the function is actually called. Yeah. Yep. It's not specific to React because it's just about how this language was created in about 10 days, how it works. Generally, if you refer to it without brackets, you're not passing like the function itself. You're creating a copy of it. So you have to make sure you bind the right value of this, so you store that context. When you call functions, you actually pass in the context in which they're called along with it. So the calling functions with the bracket notation essentially desugars to the function call. Every function in JavaScript has its own call method, in which case you pass in the execution context at that point in time. So when you have different execution contexts, you have to be very careful. And if you want to make sure you bind the value of this, you either do that manually using the bind function or use an arrow function to make sure. That might be so this might be a good thing to read, and I think I might have already included some resources about this. Let me just put this in your Slack channel. One is that, and then cool. Yeah, so this is actually quite an old. It's actually really useful to understand. When I started reading and learning JavaScript a number of years ago, this helped me. So have a look at that as well. But yeah, at the moment, if you don't want to have to worry about it, just use arrow functions if they are passed as a callback to any of your event handlers. Any other thoughts or questions on this exercise? Again, the point of this exercise is to demonstrate using a class component that needs to manage state, and a functional component that what it does is take in props and then renders a component. How's that sound? Yeah, cool. Okay, so let's turn it over back to you. So the next section of this, where are we? Yeah, the next section of this is for you to essentially do the same thing. Now you can either do exactly what I did, or you can take these requirements and have 3 buttons, red, blue, and yellow, a heading, I am a chameleon. Then you want to be able to click in each of the 3 buttons and then change the text color to change to that stated color. So you can use this just using a simple like style key value pair or attribute in your HTML with an argument. So don't think too much about it. Just pass in as a style tag. The idea is you want to be able to have a main component that manages that state of what the color, the current color of the heading, and then every time you click either of the buttons, it updates the state. So have a go, and we'll gather back together in about probably 45 minutes to see how far we're at. So map out a simple domain like I did, or any other version of this, like how you want to arrange it or see it on the page, what's going to be your class component, what's its responsibility, what's going to be the functional component. Create a new directory using create React app, and then just spike code for this. I'm not going to worry about testing because we want to just concentrate on this. And then we'll gather back for any questions. Sound good? Any questions before we separate? Cool, awesome. Enjoy, have fun. I'll be around, so Slack me if you want. Bye for now.
Thanks, Ed.